All right, Faraz, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for connecting with me recently and wanting to come on here and have this conversation with me today. But before we get started, I want to give you an opportunity to tell the listeners who are you and what it is that you do, and then we'll get on with our conversation.
Thank you, Furkan, and really, it's an honor and a privilege to be on here. I love the work that you're doing and the platform that you've created. So, thank you for having me. Um, I have a background in business as well as development. So, I have run businesses here in East Africa and also kind of worked in the nonprofit space as well, mainly with vulnerable youth. And then more recently, I am teaching and facilitating and a little bit of coaching workshops around the topics of mindfulness and emotional intelligence, which I'm really passionate about, excited to talk about.
Yeah, and where are you based normally?
Right now, I spend my time between London, UK, and Rwanda. So I'm actually in Rwanda, Kigali, Rwanda, right now.
Very cool, very cool. Yeah, I haven't had any guests from Rwanda yet, so that's awesome. And so I guess just immediately the question that came to my mind when I started chatting with you was why emotional intelligence and why is it so important in organizations?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I don't know about you, Furkan, but for me, growing up, um, I was never really taught about emotions. Um, and it was kind of implied that they were either a bad thing that needed to be avoided or contained, or they were a soft thing, and definitely not something that a boy or a man should have or should express. Um, and so I think as a result, we have a workforce, in all lines of work. It's not limited to corporate. I mean, the education space, development space, in our political institutions, etc., where people aren't really comfortable with emotions. Some of them, many of us don't actually know what an emotion is, how we experience it, how we're supposed to deal with kind of unpleasant or uncomfortable emotions. And I think as a result, there's a whole multitude of consequences to that. And so I think it's time to kind of redress that balance and trying to give some focus and energy to emotions so that and how to manage and regulate them so that we can show up better for ourselves and for each other.
Yeah, yeah, no, and that's so important. I think to add to the whole narrative you shared about emotions, I think there was an aspect of even weakness um, that was associated with showing emotions in the sense that, if you were being emotional or you were sharing your emotions, you didn't really have it together. And therefore, you couldn't be relied upon or you're kind of weak, right? So I think that was kind of the other narrative I've seen. And one of the things I often see in organizations as well is emotions aren't really put on the table because they make everyone else feel uncomfortable because they haven't dealt with their own emotions, but also it's just there's no space to talk about it because it can often detract from the focus or the business objectives. Meanwhile, you've got people experiencing emotions all the time, whether it's work related, whether it's stuff they're dealing with in their personal life. They don't have that container or space to share that or even talk about it. You kind of just almost the expectation is, and I'm speaking kind of from personal experience too, but the expectation is you kind of come in and you're a robot. You have to shut everything off that's going on below the surface. Is that something you see and have experienced as well?
Yeah, I mean, I love the points that you bring up, and kind of relaying a lot back to me as well. I as part of the kind of business work that I do, I, you know, I'm in a network called Stanford Seed, and it's where various entrepreneurs can come together, and we kind of have a leadership lab once a month or every 2 months, and we talk about our business challenges and often our adaptive challenges. And one of the participants in my group um, was really distraught because something had happened within her company. Actually, I think there had been an integrity issue and they had to let go of someone. And she said to me, and she works with her husband, and she said, "Oh, I wish I could be more like my husband." I said, "What do you mean?" And she says, "Well, he's just so cool and calm and calculated, and why do I have to be so emotional?" Um, and I thought that was really interesting and really reflective of the point that you just made. Emotions are seen as, and even when we talk about working with emotions in the workplace, we call them soft skills. I'd like to
Yeah.
turn that on his head and say, no, those are the hard skills. Um, Soft is kind of implying towards weakness, as you mentioned earlier. So these are the hard skills. This is the stuff nobody wants to deal with. That's why it's hard. And I said to this uh, colleague, or well, not even colleague, but member of my group, I said to her, "No, actually, we revere." People like that. You revere your husband for that, and that's fine. Maybe he has a logical, rational, calculated approach, but emotions, they're so full of information that's valuable
Hmm.
in decision making. There's so much there. The emotions are telling us something. And if we just stop to listen, so emotions aren't the problem here. The being overwhelmed by our emotions or being consumed by our emotions, or not being able to get the feedback that we need from our emotions is the challenge. But if we can extract that information of what the emotion is trying to tell us, then actually we can be really good decision makers. It's the data points that we're getting there from the emotion, and actually that can make us better leaders.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I guess just to understand a little bit better, like what was it like in your own personal experience then to make that shift and almost be an ambassador for emotional intelligence in the space you're in? And was that met with resistance either within yourself or those around you?
That's a really good question, Furkan. I'm just going to pause for a second to kind of
Yeah, sure.
to just not just throw something out there, but really feel into it. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of people say, well, you either have it or you don't.
Yeah.
It's like you're either good at math or you're not, or you're either an athlete or you're not. So a lot of people say we're either good at emotional intelligence or you're not. Some people are just not
Mhm.
empathic. They don't have um, they don't have an empathic bone in their body, and of course I would disagree with that. But I think a lot of us are inclined in certain ways and others in other ways, and so it comes more naturally to some people than others. And so coming back to me, I mean, I think I was fairly empathic as a leader, and I think naturally I was fairly um, intuitive to what was going on within my thoughts, within my emotions, and within those around me. So I think in that sense, even before having really studied or having the language of emotional intelligence, I think
Mhm.
it came out quite naturally. That said, I was a work in progress. I'm still a work in progress, and I still make mistakes, and I get triggered, and sometimes I don't see the whole picture, and I don't see the other person's perspective, um, and that's okay too. I think just
Mhm.
knowing that we are human beings,
Yeah.
um, and I love this. Is one of my favorite teachers, Eckhart Tolle, says we're human beings. It's so easy to focus on this being part, this expansive, conscious, all-knowing, all-loving presence,
Yeah.
we all aspire to be. And then we're humans as well. Don't forget the human part of human beings. So I think the human part is we have, we react at times, and sometimes not, as appropriately as we would like. When we look back, and we're like, oh, how could I have handled that better? So
Yeah.
to your question, I mean, I think it's been a mixed bag in my leadership experience. Um, I hope I'm evolving in the right direction, and you'll
Hmm.
ask the people that I supervise and work with for their opinion on that. But I'd like to think I'm moving in the right direction. Resistance. Look, sometimes there is this notion that this is soft stuff, this is
Yeah.
wishy-washy, woo-woo. We don't have the time for this. Now I'm teaching and facilitating, and sometimes I'm going out there and prospecting companies as to why they need a program like this in their organization. And yeah, like we don't have budget for this. It doesn't. How do I link it to the bottom line? Um,
Yeah.
that's sometimes tricky. Sometimes it's not so tangible. There are measures, of course, but it's maybe it's less tangible than something like, oh, here's a sales development program that's going to guarantee you 20% extra revenues when you put your employees through it. If you're telling them about emotional intelligence program, yeah, the measures are a little less tangible and maybe a little more long term.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And there's so many things you touched on that I want to expand on a little bit further. So I think the most recent thing you mentioned, that there's not a lot of time or resources available to spend on emotional intelligence, and it's not a big focus in many areas. I think part of the problem is, and I was reading something recently, that it's a lot of organizations, or it costs them billions of dollars because employees are getting burnt out, and because there's burnout, that impacts productivity. So how can you prevent the burnout? Well, it's certain things that you mentioned, right? It's the mindfulness, it's the emotional intelligence, being able to say, if I'm experiencing that I'm being overworked, or I'm overwhelmed, or I just need help, being able to express that with my emotions. And if I don't have that language, or I don't have that safety or container in the workplace, I'm not going to ask for that type of help. And that can impact the bottom line. We just don't connect the dots often, or a lot of organizations don't. And it is a root issue. I don't know if it's talked about as much, but I don't know what your thoughts are with regards to that.
Well, I think you're absolutely spot on. Um, I'd love I'd love to work with you, Furkan, on convincing companies why they need this knowledge, this information, and this line of work. But yes, you're right, and I think it comes down to this kind of short term versus long term approach. Companies who take a short term view and are really just about improving revenues, and bottom line in the short run,
Hmm.
may not see this as a priority area. And those who are
Yeah.
really long term view, who care about the well being of their employees, and they understand the cost of losing an employee to burnout and then having to get somebody else on board and retrain them, etc. Um, they can connect those dots in that way. So I think it really comes down to this short term versus long term thinking, and also just believing that this stuff is of value. Um, and there are tools to help with this. Like I mentioned earlier, people just believe, well, either you're good at it or you're not. It's something that can't be trained. Well, I think neuroplasticity and this kind of research that's coming out of neuroscience is showing us that our brains are changing, um, in structure and function
Yeah.
depending on what we focus on and pay attention to. And that's true of learning a new language, of learning an instrument, for example, but also true of things like mindfulness. If you practice mindfulness, practice, tools that help you develop emotional intelligence, such as empathy, then, over and over again, you will form those neural pathways and you will become better at this stuff. So,
Hmm.
and so, yeah, I
Yeah.
think you make a really good point on employee well-being. and burnout and things like that. And for the individual to practice these things for their individual well-being, this is crucial. And also, if we are better within ourselves, yeah, our emotional health is better, then we're also
Yeah.
like to be kinder in the work.
Hmm.
We're also likely to be more understanding of other people, and therefore that increases productivity, that increases collaboration, that increases creativity. So I think there are multiple kind of knock-on effects there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think the biggest probably benefit would be where you start treating people like people, right? And not machines. I think that's the biggest thing I've experienced. Not with everyone, but often there are times where, the leaders are like just so completely detached from the human side of it, as you mentioned, right? And they're just like, well, all about the results. The other thing you touched on earlier was the language around emotions, and I think, myself included, until recently, if I didn't spend the time in my personal life learning about emotions and how to voice them. I didn't have that language myself. It's something, like you said, I'm still learning and getting better at, but it's so important, and there's not enough value put on that. And people often struggle with even naming their emotions or being able to express them because they don't know what they're feeling, right? And sometimes people are come down to the very basics. They'll be like, "Oh, I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm this," but no, there's other emotions that are involved that can actually help you. When you're able to label it yourself, you're able to understand better what you're experiencing, and then by extension help others understand. And just because we don't have that language, I think there's a lot of struggle because often people don't know themselves what they're feeling or experiencing.
And you make a really, really good point, and a valid one. And I think even if we go back a step before language of naming the emotions, um, it's how do I experience this emotion? And I think if we take the time to tune in, and this is where mindfulness helps. And I don't mean mindfulness, by the way, I just mean being present, being aware.
Yeah.
The simplest definition, but still very accurate one for mindfulness. If we just take the time to be aware and direct that awareness inwards. So, for example, somebody says, I'm angry, right? If they could just take a few deep breaths and actually observe what is happening within their body, because emotions are often experienced as physiological sensations. So they're actually, and I didn't get this for a long time, you know,
Yeah.
because I was thinking my emotions. It's like, oh, I'm angry or I'm sad or but actually feel like, what am I actually feeling right now? I'm saying, what am I actually feeling right now? This happened to me the other day when I received a really nasty email and I felt anger. And I said, Faraz, where are you feeling this anger? What's going on here? And I felt some sort of pressure in my face. You know how when you see the
Hmm.
cartoon characters that get angry and their faces turn red? Actually, I felt
Yeah.
something in my face and I felt a rush in my arms. And that's actually quite accurate because that's like your fight or flight response coming on. We are hardwired to respond to threats in this way. Now, in this sense, I saw this email as a threat, and I was angry, and I was feeling um, a rush of energy in my arms, and a tightening and a contraction of my chest, and some sort of tingling in the face. That's what I was feeling, and I think
Yeah.
just being able to name that, or to be aware of that physiological response in the body, that's the emotion. What that does is it helps to contain it. It helps to not let that take us over. So instead of saying, I am angry, I am experiencing anger in the body right now.
Yeah.
A whole
Yeah.
different thing, because now suddenly, oh, I can deal with that. This is a physiological, this is an experience at a physiological level that I'm going through, and it'll
Yeah.
pass. And so, what you said about naming is really important. Um, I think there's something online called the map of emotions. I can't remember exactly. I'll share the website with you. That actually breaks down these core emotions and gives you a whole language around it, to break it down so that we can be more kind of visceral about, oh, what is this? Is this anger or is it resentment? You know, is it fear or is it anxiety? Like, what exactly is this? And I think that's helpful to some extent. But I think the core thing is feeling the emotion, as
Yeah.
this real thing in our bodies.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you for sharing that and your own experience as well. That's helpful. And I think I've seen there's that wheel of emotions. I think there's a lot of things online that you can find. What I found recently was very helpful was this book by Brene Brown. It's called Atlas of the Heart, and it breaks down like all the emotions. So that was very helpful for me. But the other thing, when you shared that physiological response, I've seen that in the group work I do as well with people. Once you're able to kind of sit with people and try to identify where you feel emotions, like for me, typically the primary one is anger, and I feel it in my chest. So when you're able to identify where you're feeling that emotion, it's a lot easier in the moment too, because now you've kind of figured out, oh, okay, associated that physiological sensation with that emotion. So when it does happen in the moment, I feel like you're way more aligned and attuned to what's going on in your body. So you're able to identify it sooner rather than, to your point, resorting to your default fight or flight response. You're able to actually identify what's going on in your body and perhaps take that extra few seconds to pause and understand. So that's very important. So thank you for sharing that. At least that's kind of been my experience too. The other thing I wanted to touch on briefly is now you're starting to see this whole, I guess, initiative around psychological safety in within organizations. One of the things I see a problem with is I don't think psychological safety is just you label something and you just say, oh yeah, here you go, this place is safe. I think you have to, with anything, model that behavior. um, the common example I use, it's the same with children, right? You can't just tell them, hey, this is a safe space, you can say whatever you want. You actually have to model it through your own behavior, and then also when they do speak up, give them that space and acceptance. And I don't think that's actually happening. I think it's just more of a, and this may sound harsh, but it's more of a checking the box type of activity. So I don't know if what your thoughts are around that, but I just wanted to yeah, get your insight and thoughts.
Yeah, I think many things in the corporate world unfortunately become checkbox exercises. And I think there may be various reasons for that. I think some of it has to do with this kind of achievement culture and, measuring everything in terms of KPIs. And so, how do we measure something like psychological safety? Well, break it down into five elements, check, 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 check. And we've seen a lot of this with DEIA work as well. Um, for me, what it really comes down to is two elements of emotional intelligence, um, which are self-awareness and empathy. And just to kind of name it, Daniel Goleman wrote Emotional Intelligence. He like popularized the whole field, and he kind of says that there are these orientations or components of emotional intelligence, which is self-awareness, self-regulation or self-management. And then I think he talks about motivation, empathy, and then social skills. Okay, so the ones that I think are crucial here in this context of what you asked, I think are self-awareness. and empathy. So if leaders in these organizations can learn how to become aware of their thoughts, their emotions, their intuitions, their impulses, um, then they're able to better understand other people in the organization, um,
Yeah.
their thoughts and impulses and intuitions and motivations. They're able to really put themselves in their shoes at times and really try to maybe not even understand, because sometimes we don't really get the experience of another fully. We're not in their shoes, so we can't really understand. But just to know that we can't really understand what this person is going through in itself is kind of an act of empathy and compassion. So look, I don't get it, but I'm here, you know,
Yeah.
and and I get that you're going through something which is tough, and I'm glad that you told me, and that kind of language creates that safe space. And so you're absolutely right. Leaders have to model it, but they need a certain amount of self awareness to be able to have the empathy to then model and create a conducive environment, as you called it, for psychological safety. And by psychological safety here, I think we mean people feeling safe to show up and to speak openly and to be vulnerable without fear of being ridiculed or reprimanded or judged um,
Yeah.
by members of their team.
Yeah, yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And two things here. First of all, I think there is that misconception with empathy. I did an episode of on empathy earlier this season as well, but the main thing is I think people often get misconstrued when they hear empathy. It doesn't mean, to your point, that you necessarily have to fully feel the emotion or experience what the other person is going through. No, I think just by having an understanding that whatever the person is going through might be tough because of what they're experiencing is enough. To your point, I don't think the expectation when it comes to empathy is feeling it. It's just recognizing that someone is going through something difficult potentially, right? And voicing that. The other piece, I do struggle with the whole notion of psychologically safe. Like, what does that even mean? I think as long as we can create safety, that's the biggest piece. I think when you put psychological in front of it, it can have certain connotations for people or interpretations. It's just adding a word that probably doesn't need to belong there as long as there's safety. But that's just my thought.
I think it's a good point, and I think maybe to be totally inclusive, it's I think a lot of people in some contexts see safety as physical safety, right? So like, am I
Yeah,
physically safe, say on the factory floor? I used to run a factory. So is this a physically safe workspace or workplace? Um, so occupational health and safety is kind of
yeah,
been clumped. So I guess the word psychological comes in to just say, well, is this safe? Is it safe to show up fully as me here with everything,
yeah,
who I am? Um, and maybe there's a better term for it or a better way of explaining that. But look, you're safe to show up in your totality. Is that really fully possible in any environment? Maybe not, but we can strive for that. That
yeah,
look, you're welcome here, and you're welcome to show up fully here, um, and your views and opinions and are welcome here.
yeah.
As long as you are being respectful and understanding of other people's, other people and their space and what they're bringing as well. So
Of course.
yeah,
Yeah,
a good
yeah. No,
point.
no. Thank you for building on that. I just wanted to shift gears a little bit, but I wanted to understand just personally and maybe for the listeners too, what initiated your whole mindfulness journey? Like, because I know for me, it was kind of like not ever being given the space to be myself or not feeling like I could be myself at times. Mindfulness has really helped me with that journey, but there were certain things that triggered that for me and wanting to really look inward. to be able to make improvements in my life. What facilitated that for you? Like, why is mindfulness something? It sounds like it's something you prioritize. Has it always been like that, or is that something that you embarked on, in the recent few years? Or
Yeah, I mean, you really bring up a great point that I just want to highlight, which is often um, this kind of journey towards mindfulness or being more present comes from some sort of, it's facilitated by something, to use your words. And what facilitated that for you is the question you asked me. And often it is kind of hardship, suffering, grief, loss, something, some difficult emotion actually, or emotional experience that is a doorway to that. And for me, it was actually a physical health condition. So when I was about 19 years old, I um, I had this rare motility disorder of the esophagus, to be very specific. And basically, I couldn't swallow my food properly, and I was having a lot of discomfort, and I ended up having a few operations to try to resolve that. And it was very frustrating and uncomfortable. And I felt very victimized. Why me? Why can't I be drinking and partying with my friends, at that age? Priorities. And so, I think it kind of forced me to look within a little bit. And also, I was exposed to different systems of medicine because at that point, Western or allopathic medicine had its limits. There came a point where, after a few operations and several, types of medication and little relief, the doctors were like, "This is all we can do." And then I kind of started exploring alternative medicine, things like acupuncture and kinesiology and chiropractic and osteopathy and stuff which I previously may have viewed as woo-woo or unscientific. And I started to
yeah,
open my mind to these things, and they actually really helped me. And then I had to look at, okay, how did acupuncture, which is some sort of energy medicine, help me? And then, what is this energy that they talk about? In India, they call it prana. In Japan, they call it ki. In China, they call it chi. What is this life force
yeah,
energy that everyone's talking about? And then that led me to the source of, what is the source of this life force energy that flows through our meridians. And that's where I kind of came across the work of Eckhart Tolle, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote The Power
yeah,
of Now. So that was in 2000. So yeah, I was about 19. I was about no, about about 19, 18, 19 when I picked up that book, and it kind of changed my whole perspective on things. Um, I was just like, oh, there's a different way to look at this. I became very interested in the present moment. And then I looked at different spiritual traditions, whether it was Sufism or Hinduism or Buddhism. And I realized that there's a common denominator. They might have different rites and rituals and ways of doing things and ways of worshiping, ways of praying.
yeah,
Ultimately, they're all saying that the secret to happiness, well being, is living in the present moment. So then I kind of became obsessed with this whole living in the present moment thing. But it was very separate. It was weird because I would have a little meditation practice. I'd sit and meditate, and I'd try to be present. And then I'd go to work and run my business without really thinking about how does the rubber hit the road. It was kind of, I think a lot of people do this actually. There's a distinction.
yeah,
This spiritual esoteric part about living in the present and meditating, and then you go to work and you just are like everything and you're like everyone else, and you don't really give a second thought to it. I think it was later, much later in my life, that I started to realize that actually this is a living, breathing practice. Like, this is about showing up in every moment of every day, in
yeah.
every conversation, in every relationship, in every interaction is an opportunity to be present and mindful. And yeah, and that kind of changed the game for me.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And you're so right that despite building these practices in our personal life, we seldom translate that into, you kind of, again, put on a mask once you get into work or in the office, and then it's hard. You forget about how valuable staying in the present moment, like you mentioned, is, especially in the workplace. So I think being able to bridge that gap is important for most people, and maintaining that even in the workplace, I think, is very beneficial and helpful. I guess as we come to an end here, Faraz, I just want to understand. So, as whether it's organizations or members of an organization, we've kind of touched on it in various ways, but I just want to tie it all together. What can people do to be more present? And we've touched on mindfulness, but even being able to feel comfortable and speaking their truth in the workplace, whether you're the employer or employee, like, what are some things people can do to improve that situation, or all the things we've talked about so far?
Yeah, no, great question. So actually, the course I teach is called Search Inside Yourself. It was developed at Google, and it's really about these practical tools. I like that you're getting to the practicality of things. One of the things we kind of advocate for is just taking 3 breaths, and we can do that here right now, actually. Um, so on the first breath, so I'll explain it and then we can do it together. On the first breath, um, we can just notice the inhalation and the exhalation. Just notice the function of breathing. And then on the second breath, we can actually just relax our bodies and just notice if there's any tension and perhaps invite it to release. And then on the third breath, we can actually ask ourselves what's important now. So let's do that together for kind of few.
Sure. Yeah.
So first breath, noticing breathing. Second breath, just relaxing the body, releasing any tension. Third breath, asking ourselves what's important now. So how was that experience for you, Furkan?
Um, I mean, I like to think I'm pretty present and aware, but for me, it was so important to just slow things down. So, like, just being aware of just this present moment and experiencing this conversation. And even though I'm here present, it was so important to slow it down and bring I guess, myself, the seed itself, to the present.
Yeah, I think it's like a reset for me. I love the way you described it, like just coming back to the present.
Yeah.
Um, And I think it's like a little bit of a reset. Sometimes we're so lost in all our emails and the little confrontation we had with a colleague or something that's going on at home or something that's going on with our parents or our kids that we're just not, we don't have the we feel we don't have the capacity to be present. We're like, oh, I don't have 20 minutes to meditate. Are you crazy? Who has time for that? But when
Yeah.
you do it in just 3 breaths before walking into a meeting, before starting a new task, before giving a presentation, if we can just practice that, and I invite you, the listeners, to try this out. It sounds so simple, almost too simple. If you can try out this 3 breath practice, micro practice even, and see what happens to your state of mind, and then other people in the room. Another example of what you can do is if you get a few people on board, is maybe as you're about to start a meeting, everybody's coming in with all their baggage, with all their emotional baggage, and all scattered maybe after lunch or something, and just like inviting everyone, shall we take a moment to arrive? You know, and it could just be grounding, sitting, feeling our feet on the ground in this moment, taking a few breaths in and out, It could be inviting everyone to just take a moment and think of what they're grateful for. Um, and I know that your work environment may or may not, depending on your position as well, be conducive or open to that. But I think it's really up to you to kind of decipher what are the things that I can seed here, that I can wield a little bit of influence, or just do it yourself. Just doing it yourself will impact the experience of everybody that you interact with, and that can be contagious in itself. And
Mhm.
you get a group or your team. Let's say you're in charge of a team, and not kind of imposing anything on anyone. We're not trying to preach or push anything down people's throats. It's literally like, what would make this a more pleasant experience for you? How could this meeting work better for you? How's everyone arriving? I know that during COVID, with Zoom meetings, I mean, that was kind of an important part of it, just having that check-in. Um,
Mhm.
Starting a meeting, it makes such a difference, because to your earlier point, Furkan, we need to humanize the workplace again. It's like too many workplaces have become very machine-like, just looking
Yeah,
at outputs, results, bottom line, etc., and targets, and how far are we from our targets, as opposed to there's 5 human beings, let's say, in this meeting. How is everyone today? How are you arriving? What's going on for you? And then, yes, let's jump into where's everyone at with their targets, etc. But let's honor
yeah.
the being first.
Yeah, yeah, and thank you for walking us and me through the exercise. Appreciate that, and it's so important, right? I think if we can build and foster that environment, then you're actually looking out for each other in the real sense, rather than focusing on numbers and results. Which I mean, I they are important, but I think your people delivering those are more important. And when you can kind of foster that environment and look out for each other, it does create you know, a great workplace. It's like any community I'm a part of, where we're just showing up for each other with no other intention, but then just showing up for each other. And it's so valuable when people feel that human connection. They actually want to be there with you, right? And that's also very important when you consider a workplace.
That's beautiful. Showing up for each other and showing up for ourselves.
Hmm.
In this moment, am I showing up for myself? Am I honoring
Yeah,
my needs? Am I fully embodied? Am I taking the time to center and ground it and be fully here? And then can I show up for others, right? Because you can't give from an empty cup. Uh,
yeah,
so can I show up for myself? For myself, can I show up for others? Uh, and really be present to what's important now.
yep, yep. No, thank you. That yeah, you're right. Show up for yourself first, and that's the most important thing. So thank you for that, for us. And yeah, as we come to an end here, I just again want to thank you for your time. I appreciate this conversation. I gained so much out of it. But for listeners that would like to learn more about you or even get a hold of you, are there ways that people can find you online or social media, whatever platforms you use?
Yeah, I'm online. I'm on LinkedIn as Faraz, Faraz, Ramji, Ramji. I think that's probably the best way to get hold of me. And I'd love to hear from you. So please reach out.
Well, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me. It's my passion, and I just believe that everybody should have access to this knowledge, these tools, and if there's any sharing that I can do that can further that, it's just a delight. So thank you.